Good afternoon. I'm Ken Cochran. I'm a co-founder of Friends of Park County and your host, very amateur host for today's Education in Action webinar on conflict mitigation and beyond. This program is being recorded and will be available on Friends of Park County's website for later viewing. I will maybe be muting all participants if we get background noise, so it doesn't interfere with the participants being able to hear our presentation. Please place questions to Robert, Jessen, or Randy in the chat box, and I will address them to the presenters at the end of the program, all three of the presentations. Raise your hand through reaction menu at the bottom right of your screen, or do the classic wave your hand or speak up if I don't see you and you'd like to have your questions presented to the panelists. I'll now turn the program over to Friends of Park County Chairperson Frank Schroeder to start today's program.
Thank you, Ken. We promise all you participants that it's not going to be as complicated as Ken's introduction and instructions to you. I'm Frank Schroeder, Chair of the board and co-founder of Friends of Park County. The organization was founded to promote thoughtfully planned growth to protect and enhance Park County's vibrant communities, sustainable working lands, and healthy natural resources. Our sole focus is on the land use issues in Park County and its communities. This webinar centers on Park County's proposed conflict mitigation zoning district regulations. It's a mouthful, so we'll just say conflict mitigation regulations for short. We will also consider some examples of traditional zoning that would serve our needs better. Before we get into the details, it's important to remind everybody why we're doing this. Like you, we don't get up in the morning excited to talk about details of local government regulations. We would rather be thinking about what we're going to do after work, going fishing on the Yellowstone, taking a walk with our dog in the mountains, doing a bit of hunting, or just sitting and watching the elk, the bison, and the pronghorns graze in front of the absorkies. All those things are so important to us. They are the reason many of us choose to live here. And that's why we need to have this webinar. Because all of those things are threatened by the wave of rural sprawl. Everything from luxury ranchettes to golf courses to outlet malls, that's engulfing all the counties around national parks. And another part of that threat is homes and apartments are becoming too expensive for average working people to live in Park County where they work. We can easily end up like other places in the region where the only housing you can afford is a 1-hour commute away. Friends of Park County believes Park County is not somehow magically insulated from the wave of sprawl. The skyrocketing home prices in our county, trailing surely enough in the wake of what is happening in Dallas County, are proof enough of that. We think rural sprawl can be stopped. It has been in other places and needs to be stopped here. Friends of Park County is presenting this webinar as part of our continuing effort to understand the various approaches to stopping rural sprawl that have worked elsewhere. We need to understand them to decide which parts of these approaches will work here in our Park County. So that's the reason for the webinar today and why we formed Friends of Park County. The conflict mitigation regulations have been under development and review by the Park County Planning Department and Park County Planning Board since the fall of 2019. Gene Keffler and I, Gene's another co-founder of Friends of Park County, were on the planning board at that time. Over the past 6 months, Friends of Park County has testified on several occasions about and made suggestions for improvements to the draft conflict mitigation regulations. At its April 2021 meeting, the Park County Planning Board decided to proceed to present the draft conflict mitigation ordinance in a series of public hearings over the next few months. Based on the response in the fall, they will consider whether and how to modify the present version, and if they wish to forward it to the County Commission for adoption. As I mentioned, we believe there is a better way to accomplish the same purpose, a traditional zoning ordinance. We also strongly believe that the biggest threat to Park County is not a gold mine or a tire dump, but rather rural sprawl. Rural sprawl and how it hurts ranchers, wildlife, water, and taxpayers was the subject of our prior webinar, which you can watch through a link on our website, friendsofparkcounty.org. Today, we will be presenting a description and analysis of the draft conflict mitigation regulations and about some current Montana zoning ordinances that help limit sprawl, which we think are worth considering as a defense to the sprawl that is overwhelming nearby counties. Along the way, we will draw out the contrast between these two approaches. We are also considering drafting a traditional zoning ordinance as an alternative to the conflict mitigation ordinance, simply to illustrate how it could be used to prohibit and limit proposed land uses with high negative impacts. Stay tuned on that subject. Now, on to the presentations. Our presenters have more than 80 years of experience in planning and land use regulations among them. All three of them have graciously agreed to donate their time to this educational webinar. We thank them for their pro bono contributions to helping us and you keep Park County magnificent, livable, and affordable. We expect our presenters to complete their remarks in 40 to 45 minutes, and then we'll have a few minutes to answer your questions and hear your comments about the presentation. Our first presenter is Robert Liberty, who is a part of our consulting team. Robert is a land use attorney with 40 years of experience in the drafting, administration, and evaluation of land use plans and regulations across the U.S. He has served as a nonprofit land use attorney, an elected official, a county land use hearings officer, and a planning consultant. Robert has extensive experience with planning topics as varied as farm and forest land protection, reforming residential zoning, and new approaches to planning for major transportation projects. He is the chair of the Columbia River Gorge National Scenic Area Commission. Robert is going to describe and analyze the draft conflict mitigation ordinance. Robert, over to you.
Thank you, Frank. I'm going to call up my presentation now. Not that one. I have another one here. All right, can everyone see that?
No.
Okay. The wonders of technology.
Make sure I've given you share. Yep, you have share. So for those of you who have joined after the original announcement, I'm Tim Cochran, I'm your host. Please put your questions in the chat box or raise your hand on the reaction menu. And if push comes to shove, just wave your hand on the screen or say, please may I ask a question at the end of all three presentations. And it looks like we're ready to go.
Let me get this called up. Those of you who have not worked with Zoom, at some point you'll experience the same awkwardness. All right, is that visible now?
Perfect.
All right, thank you. What I'm going to be discussing today are the Park County Conflict Mitigation Zoning District Regulations. This is the draft from March 18th, 2021. It's available on the county's website. The excerpts I'm going to be quoting from the regulations appear in black in this font, and all of their text is in this font. So you can tell what I'm quoting from and when I'm speaking about the draft conflict mitigation regulations. These are the questions I'm going to address. Where would these regulations apply? What uses would be prohibited? What uses wouldn't require a permit? What uses would require a permit? what criteria would be used to make decisions? So first question, where would these regulations apply? Section 6 of the draft regulations state this district applies to all unincorporated areas of Park County. So all private land outside the city limits of Livingston and Clyde Park. What uses would be prohibited? Section 8, no type of land use is strictly prohibited, but may be prohibited if a conditional use permit is required and associated impacts are not mitigated through the conditional use permitting process under Section 10 of these regulations. So no type of land use is strictly prohibited, but may be prohibited if the associated impacts are not mitigated under the terms of the regulation. So any of the following uses may be permitted anywhere in the county if any negative impacts can be adequately mitigated in the opinion of the zoning administrator or the Board of Adjustment. Asphalt batch plant, gold mine, tire dump, big box store, warehouse, restaurants, office parks, subdivisions, destination resorts, private airports, golf courses, gated communities. In other words, any form of rural sprawl can be permitted anywhere in the county if the negative impacts are mitigated. What you see is a slice of the kind of sprawl that's overtaking the greater Yellowstone region. Everything from commercial and industrial on the right, golf courses, scattered home sites, subdivisions. All of that may be permitted anywhere in the county outside the city of Livingston and Clyde Park if a determination made that negative impacts are mitigated. What uses are permitted? Now, this can be a little confusing term. What this means is they can be built without any county review. The ordinance, the regulations don't apply to them. There's two sets of uses, permitted uses. The following land uses are permitted within the district, that means the entire county, on an individual tract of record and do not require review and approval prior to implementation. So build without getting a permit with no review. So that includes agricultural uses and structures. I don't quote the whole lengthy definition. And residential. The following residential land uses are permitted on each tract of record and under these regulations. A, up to 3 dwelling units, attached or detached, which are for as full-time human habitation, seasonal human habitation, long-term rentals, and short-term rentals, including all accessory buildings and uses. Okay, it's a mouthful, but basically 3 dwellings, you can use and live in them part-time, rent them out, use them as rental properties on every existing tract of record. So, examples, this developed near the Arrowhead School, no county review, no permit required. No county review and no permit required for a single-family dwelling, a duplex, or a threeplex. Now, yes, duplex and triplex homes are needed, for example, in Gardner, but not anywhere and everywhere in the county. Traditional zoning would identify where these kinds of homes and apartments could be built, where they're needed, and where they can't be built. But right now, any of these kinds of homes could be permitted on any tract. No county review and no permit required for vacation rentals, for building the vacation rentals and the accessory uses and structures, like swimming pools and garages and recreational facilities. No county review, no permit required for building on existing lots. And there are thousands of them. What uses would require development permit? All land uses which do not meet the definition of residential or agricultural land use, which you saw above, shall apply for and receive an approved conditional use permit under Section 10 of these regulations prior to implementation. So everything else is the answer to that question. Then the question is, what criteria would be used to make decisions? This is a little bit longer, but Section 11 states review criteria. If during the analysis of the conditional use permit application, the zoning administrator and or the Board of Adjustment determines negative impacts may be associated with the proposed land use, and based upon specified findings of fact, the zoning administrator and or the Board of Adjustment shall either require specific conditions of approval which mitigate identified negative impacts, or deny the proposed conditional use permit application, determine negative impacts cannot be mitigated through required conditions. All right, that's kind of a mouthful. Here's the summary. Here are the options for decision. There's no negative impacts. You approve the application. That part's clear. There are negative impacts. You can approve the application with conditions to mitigate the negative impacts. Or if there's negative impacts, you can decide to deny the application. There is a list of negative impacts in the draft regulations organized under these topical headings A through H. The numbers in parentheses are the 5 specifically identified negative impacts that are to be considered. The total is 42. Now, those are not actually criteria, they're just list of things to be considered as potential negative impacts. This is the core. It's called a conflict mitigation regulation. So the core is that negative impacts must be mitigated. This is the critical word, mitigate. What does that mean? Well, it's not defined in the draft regulations. That's not a problem because it's a very common word. Here's the definition in Webster's. To make less severe, intense, harsh, rigorous, to diminish, to lessen. So it doesn't say what amount. It means to reduce or lessen by any amount or any degree. It does not mean eliminate or completely offset. So if there was something that produced air or noise pollution, a 10% reduction in pollution or noise satisfies the requirement of mitigation because it's lessened. So let's take an example. This is the Antilolepis americana schroederi. They have 1,000 acres of habitat near immigrant and prey. So let's consider what mitigating the loss of 1,000 acres of jackalope habitat would mean when reviewing 5 proposals for ranchette subdivisions. Here's the operative section, or one of the operative sections in the draft regulation. H, the factors to be considered negative impacts. Will the proposed land use impact wildlife and wildlife habitat, including but not limited to, 1, will the proposed land use eliminate critical wildlife habitat as may be defined by Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks? All right, so there's the proposed subdivision that was going to go into the jackalope habitat, but the applicant mitigates it by reducing the impact on the jackalope habitat. So they save 80% of the 1,000 acres. And the next proposal also saves 80% of those 800 acres. So only 20% is lost. They've mitigated the impact. The third one comes in. They also save 80% of the habitat. Only take 20%. The fourth, 410 acres, they only take 20% of the 512 acres, and you get to number 5. Unfortunately, jackalopes need 400 acres to survive minimum, so they're extinct. Each time it was mitigated. This is a basic problem. Mitigation does not mean eliminate negative impacts. And secondly, as this example shows, you review each permit in isolation, meaning there's no way to consider the cumulative impacts of the decisions. Let's take an actual example from a neighboring county, Teton County, Wyoming. This is Fish Creek, beautiful, characteristic of the region. But 815 septic systems were approved in the watershed. Each one generates 25,000 pounds of pollution a year. And now you will find this sign next to Fish Creek. Swimming or float tubing in these waters should be avoided, posted by a doctor, because bacterial levels in these waters at times exceeded recommended DEQ standards. Each individual septic permit was approved. Each of them met the required standard. But cumulatively, they polluted the creek. Now, this is a map. Sorry, it's a little bit fuzzy, but this is a map taken right out of the growth policy that's being adopted for Livingston. This is the area around Livingston, and those colored dots represent septic permits. It's no surprise that this area up here had to be annexed because of the risk that septic pollution would leak into the Yellowstone River. So this is an example of case-by-case review that fails to consider cumulative impacts. Let's go back. What are the options for decision? No negative impacts, you approve the application. Negative impacts, approve the application with conditions to lessen negative impacts, or you can deny the application. All right, the first one's pretty obvious, no impacts, approve. But how do you choose between the two? What criteria are used to decide between approving the project subject to conditions mitigating negative impacts or just denying the application? There aren't any. So this is the final thought. Under section 11, it states the zoning administrator shall recommend and the Board of Adjustment shall determine specific findings of fact related to each review criteria. Now, they're not criteria, they're just factors. But that means the zoning administrator and Board of Adjustment will need to make specific findings of fact on a minimum of 42 separate topics for each application. So this is not going to be a simple, quick process. Everything's handled case by case with 42 findings of fact minimum. Here's the summary. There are thousands of legal tracts in Park County. 3 homes to live in or to rent out may be built on each of those tracts without any review under the proposed regulations. 2, any type of land use may be permitted anywhere in the county outside Livingston and Clyde Park if, in the opinion of the zoning administrator, the Board of Adjustment, any negative impacts can be adequately lessened. Unlike in a true zoning ordinance, no uses are prohibited. 3, there are no criteria to help the zoning administrator, Board of Adjustment, the applicants, or neighbors to know when the application may be approved with conditions and when it may be denied. 4, because it is a permit processing system and not a zoning ordinance, there is no analysis of the cumulative long-term impacts from all the approved land uses, no understanding or plan for what the future of the county will be, because each application is processed and approved in isolation. Conclusion is that these are reasons why Friends of Park County believes that traditional zoning ordinance is needed to prevent rural sprawl, to stop high impact land uses, and to provide a clear vision for the long-term future of Park County. Thank you.
Thanks, Robert. That's to the friends who are watching, I've seen this presentation 3 times and it never gets any better. The presentation is excellent, but the concerns continue to worry us. So our next presenter is Jessen Bremer, a partner in the Bozeman law firm of Gallick, Bremer, and Malloy. She has more than 13 years of experience with land regulation in Western Montana, including service as a deputy county attorney in Gallatin County and as legal counsel to the Montana Department of Environmental Quality. Jessen represented neighbors in the controversies about the high impact land uses in Park County that were the origin of the conflict mitigation ordinance. Jessen will provide a sketch of the 2 different types of zoning in Montana and then describe the Spring Hill zoning district. Jessen is currently advising clients in that zoning district about proposed changes the county is considering that would affect that zoning district. Jessen, over to you.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Robert. I've been asked to describe Part 1 and Part 2 zoning and provide examples that have been successful at regulating rural residential development. I understand the objectives of Friends of Park County is to protect rural residential and the agricultural character of the county and to implement the county's growth policy. Next slide. As noted in the county growth policy, because little of Park County is zoned, there's no accurate way to project what type and intensity of development will occur and where it will occur. This is especially problematic when planning for and investing in public infrastructure needed to serve a growing population. And the population of Montana is growing at a rapid pace. The COVID pandemic has exacerbated this in the last year, which compounds the development pressure on Park County. And as recognized by the county growth policy, planning for the types and intensity of development, where it will occur, and related infrastructure planning are benefits of zoning, which can provide predictability for landowners, developers, and the local government. Next slide. The proposed conflict mitigation zoning, based on granting of permits, does not provide the predictability typically associated with more traditional planning-based zoning. It does not prohibit land uses, even if incompatible, as you've heard from Robert Liberty. Traditional zoning seeks to avoid conflict by prohibiting certain uses considered incompatible with the purposes and intent of the district. In a geographic area, there will be some areas or districts in which certain uses are compatible, and zoning should address that straight on to provide predictability for landowners. The conflict mitigation zoning does not address residential development and subdivision, which can result in sprawl and piecemeal replacement of the agricultural character of an area. Tools that contribute to preserving rural residential and agricultural character and open space may include density minimums, development rights, and density bonuses in exchange for open space protection, among others. These types of tools are fundamental if the objective is preserving the rural residential and agricultural character of Park County. Next slide. There are other options to conflict mitigation zoning. Gallatin County has over 20 zoning districts, each with its own regulations. While a deputy county attorney in Gallatin County, I became familiar with zoning districts that have been effective at preserving agricultural character and open space and minimizing subdivision development and sprawl. 3 of those zoning districts are Bridger Canyon, Spring Hill, and Reese Creek. Bridger Canyon and Spring Hill are Part 1 zoning districts, and Reese Creek is a Part 2 zoning district, which brings me to the description of Part 1 and Part 2 zoning. So there are 2 statutory frameworks for adopting zoning regulations in rural parts of the state. Part 1, or citizen petition zoning, and Part 2, or top-down county zoning. Part 1 zoning may be adopted whenever the public interest or convenience may require, and upon the petition of 60% of real property owners in the proposed district. This type of zoning requires adoption of a development pattern for the physical and economic development of the district, and this is typically in the form of a comprehensive plan. Part 2 zoning requires an adopted growth policy, with the zoning implementing the provisions of the growth policy. This type of zoning may be adopted by the county unilaterally without being petitioned by citizens. Next slide. Notice and the opportunity to comment are required before either type of zoning is adopted, and the county must strictly follow procedural requirements that are provided by statute. Both Part 1 and Part 2 zoning allow the regulation of uses and the regulation of construction, alteration, and maintenance and repair of buildings and structures. Now I'll get back to those examples of zoning regulations and how they've protected agricultural lands, open space, and the rural residential character of certain areas of Gallatin County. Next slide. The Spring Hill zoning district occupies 29.5 square miles, 6.25 of which are public lands within the Gallatin National Forest. 3 components of the Spring Hill zoning ordinance have preserved the rural residential and agricultural character of that zoning district: density restrictions, subdivisions as a conditional use, and development rights. Randy, who follows me, will explain Spring Hill zoning in further detail. Next slide. The Reese Creek zoning regulation was patterned after Spring Hill and covers an area directly north of Spring Hill. I think you might go one more slide. Sorry, this is Reese Creek. This regulation also utilizes tools including density limits or lot size restrictions, development rights, cluster development, and the option of transferring development rights to achieve its unique purposes. Next slide. Some of those unique purposes include being proactive rather than reactive, preserving property values and rights, including the ability to divide and sell private properties, recognizing and providing protection for agriculture, preserving scenic resources, views, and providing adequate open space, preserving scenic night skies by controlling the use of exterior lighting, and maintaining community diversity by planning for a variety of lot sizes. The Reese Creek zoning also includes more traditional purposes of zoning, but I've been asked to focus on Bridger Canyon. Next slide. Which is one of the oldest zoning districts in the state of Montana, if not the oldest. It was adopted on July 12, 1971. In addition to promoting the public health, safety, and general welfare, the purposes of the Bridger Canyon zoning regulation include preventing overcrowding, conserving property values, preserving scenic resources, ensuring high water quality standards, protecting agricultural lands from the effects of urban encroachment, promoting business, residential uses, tourism, and recreational uses, but not to the point that they destroy the character of the area or threaten water quality, traffic, or fire safety. And encouraging innovations in residential development so that growing demands for housing may be met by greater variety in type, design, and layout of tracts, and by conservation and a more efficient use of open space ancillary to such housing. The intent, next slide. The intent of Bridger Canyon zoning is also to preserve agriculture as one of the primary occupational pursuits and economic endeavors in Bridger Canyon. Next slide. These purposes are achieved in large part through permitted and conditional uses allowed and through restrictions on parcel size. The minimum parcel size is no less than 40 acres with one development unit. Where additional density is desired or smaller parcel sizes than 40 acres per residential unit, the planned unit development process must be followed. The planned unit development or PUD process is intended to provide for alternative forms of development, which may include a density bonus in exchange for development quality that is of significant community benefit. Additional density, if approved, is one density unit per 20 acres. Next slide. There are 4 specific conditions that must exist in order for a PUD to be allowed. The planned unit development must allow flexibility of design for the protection of scenic vistas, or it will lessen the impact of visual impact of development. The planned unit development will result in the preservation of agricultural land or open space. The parcel may contain natural assets which will be preserved through the use of the planned unit development. And those natural assets may include vegetation, stands of trees, land that serves as natural habitat for wildlife, and streams. Or the parcel must contain topography suitable for minimizing the visual impact of development. In many cases, several of these are in existence. Next slide. The trade-off of additional density is allowed for development that enhances and preserves open space and unique natural features, that preserves to the maximum extent possible natural characteristics of the land, including topography, vegetation, streams, and tree cover, that protects areas of important wildlife habitat, encourages development of more attractive site designs, and lessens the visual impact of development, and preserves scenic vistas and rural atmosphere, and preserves agricultural lands. Next slide. Given the approval criteria for planned unit developments and the specific development standards required, impacts related to increased density are mitigated, and PUDs are reviewed through the conditional use process, which allows additional conditions to be placed on the development to further mitigate impacts. Another tool in Bridger Canyon for additional density rights is the transfer of development right process. By moving from density from one area of the district to another, there's actually no net increase of density in the zoning district. Now, this is not a perfect system. Based on the minimum density requirement, Bridger Canyon could be comprised of many 40-acre parcels, but this hasn't happened in the 50+ years the zoning has been in place. As I understand, there are only a handful of 40-acre subdivisions and only a dozen or so planned unit developments with higher density. And that's not readily apparent on a drive through Bridger Canyon due to the specific PUD requirements. So these zoning districts utilize tools of traditional zoning that balance preservation of open space and agricultural lands with granting of additional density. And with that, I believe I'm out of time. Thank you.
Justin, thanks a lot. That was informative and terrific. So our final presenter is Randy Johnson. Randy has just completed 31 years of service in the Gallatin County Planning Department as lead senior planner and subdivision and zoning manager. He's a member of the American Institute of Certified Planners. His work included the development and administration of the award-winning Spring Hill Zoning District. He has been an adjunct professor at MSU, where he earned his Bachelor of Science. Randy has a Master's of Science in Rural, Town, and Regional Planning from the University of Montana. Randy's going to touch on what he believes makes for a good zoning ordinance, and then describe the Spring Hill Zoning District in Gallatin County. Over to you, Randy.
Randy, you're muted.
Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Okay. Thank you, Frank, again for that nice introduction. I've been asked to talk about the Spring Hill Zoning District in Gallatin County as an example of a successful Part 1 traditional zoning district. I'm going to share my screen here, if anybody can see that. There we go. Can you see that?
Yes.
So the Spring Hill community is located along the western front of the Bridger Mountain Range. Located approximately 10 miles north of Bozeman, the Spring Hill community is home to active farms and ranches and to those people who enjoy rural living. The Spring Hill Planning and Zoning District covers approximately 29.5 square miles, 16.25 of which are public lands located within the Gallatin National Forest. Due to the increased pressures for new residential development and concerns over unplanned growth within the area, Spring Hill community residents petitioned the Gallatin County Board of County Commissioners in the spring of 1990 to create a planning and zoning district. The commission then appointed a citizens advisory committee to assess community goals and objectives and advise a planning agency in the planning process. The Spring Hill Community Plan is intended to guide future growth and development of the area and preserve the natural and scenic qualities of its agricultural heritage. Agriculture and open space land planning protects the rural environment, including mountainside, steep slopes, forest, wildlife habitat, riparian areas, etc., from the impact of development. It also serves as a clean air shed to clean the atmosphere, as well as a mechanism to protect the quantity and atmosphere and water resources. Additionally, it provides productive, privately maintained agricultural open space with environmental benefits that include rural aesthetics and air and water quality. The provision of public services and facilities associated with haphazard or leapfrog subdivisions cost money. With limited fiscal resources, it is important that non-renewable land resources be conserved, thereby encouraging orderly growth and development around existing urbanized areas. Growth and development may be guided in terms of location and density through an agricultural and open space land use plan and zoning regulations. Public costs and urban sprawl are thereby reduced while protecting a viable industry. More efficient utilization of transportation facilities and reduced costs are made possible if a compact growth pattern is implemented. A dispersed pattern of growth away from population and service centers encourages automobile travel, thus increasing energy demands and travel time. The zoning ordinance provides appropriate methods to meet the goals of the Spring Hill community residents. The methods are based on the importance of agricultural, open space, and rural lifestyles within the planning districts. Methods are available for guiding the partial development of agricultural lands within the district. Now, I want to talk a little bit specifically about the mechanics of the Spring Hill zoning district. The base density within the district is established at 1 residence per 160 acres, with the opportunity to create additional residences at a density of 1 unit per 80 acres, with requirements for clustering and the transfer of development rights. With clustering, no more than 15% of an original tract of record can be developed, with the remaining 85% of the tract preserved as agricultural lands and open space. Development rights may be transferred from one property to another, with the requirement that any transfer development right can only be placed within 15% of the buildable area of the receiving tract of record. What's key to this, if the zoning district were to utilize all available development rights, 85% of land within the district would remain as agricultural and open space lands. The Spring Hill zoning regulation is a proven and tested traditional land use regulation that, one, implements the Spring Hill Community Development Plan, establishes uses and development standards that are predictable and objective in advance of a development proposal, and three, provides administrative provisions which address the continuation of pre-existing or grandfathered non-conforming uses and structures. It addresses variances, special uses, agricultural use considerations, and enforcement procedures. In conclusion, as a traditional Part 1 zoning regulation, the Spring Hill zoning regulation provides the necessary tools, procedures, and regulatory framework to successfully manage growth in a rural agriculture area within Gallatin County. I encourage anybody visiting Bozeman to take the 10-minute drive north and drive around and look at the Spring Hill landscape, and you can see how the land has not changed in the 30+ years that it's been adopted. It's been very successful in addressing the needs of the community, and the tools available in the zoning regulation have done a great job of preserving the agricultural lands in open space in that rural area of Gallatin County. And again, also, if you're here, take a drive through Bridger Canyon, as Jessen described, and you will see the positive effects of a traditional zoning regulation. That concludes my presentation.
Randy, thank you very much. That was informative, as the other two have been as well. So we have a little time for questions and answers, and maybe brief comments from people who have been watching and listening.
Randy, do you want
to ask a question or make a brief comment? You can either wave your hand or use the raise hand function on Zoom. But I see that there is, Peter Brown's already asked a question for you, Randy. Ken, do you want to read it out? It's in the chat box, or you want me to? I can do it.
I was looking at something else, trying to get.
I'll do it right now. Okay. I'll do it. It's okay. From Peter Brown. How will SB 264, that's the John S. catastrophe, impact the ability of Park County and its citizens to establish Type 1 and Type 2 zoning districts? It was passed and ratified in this past legislative session. So do you, Randy, have a comment? Or
well, if I'm correct, is that the creation of a zoning district and regarding subsurface rights? I'm not quite familiar with SB whatever 222. I apologize.
I can.
All right. Anybody else have a? Robert?
Let me call up, I wrote a memo for the board on this, and just give me a moment so I can find it. Why don't you go on to the next question while I find it?
All right, I'll go to the second one while you're looking for that. And this, Randy, is for you, from Wendy Riley of Park County Environmental Council, co-chair. Can you please provide an example or examples of the timeline needed to prepare a zoning district? And another one is Gallatin County has tried county-wide zoning before. What happened to that effort and why?
You bet. First question regarding the typical time it takes from start to finish with a zoning district. Prior to beginning the process of writing the zoning district, the citizens need to get together and define their geographic boundaries. They have to go through gathering signatures to demonstrate that they have 60% of the freeholders representing that particular area. Then that petition is presented to the Gallatin County or to the county commission. As part of their consideration, the clerk recorder's office would have to verify the signatures, making sure and certifying that it does represent the 60%. But once the district's created, typically then the process is to develop a neighborhood plan and regulations to implement that plan. Time-wise, I'm just going to say after that petition to create the district is finalized, Spring Hill took a little over 2 years from start to finish to adoption. The Big Sky zoning district took 6 years. Thinking Reese Creek took a couple years, South Gallatin took, close to 2 years. So on average, 2 years, but I think the more complex districts like Big Sky would take more because you have a lot more stakeholders involved, a lot more government agencies, particularly in a growing area where you have a resort district. But more rural areas, I would say, 2 years plus or minus a few months.
Okay.
And
Great, thank you, Robert. Well, I'll tell you, Robert,
Well, there's,
go ahead. The second one is what happened in Gallatin County. Have you tried it? What happened to the effort and why?
Countywide zoning. Yes, during my tenure, there was 3 efforts to adopt countywide zoning. The first one was a permit system that was done in the early 90s. The second one was kind of like an open space preserve type regulation where in exchange for allowing to develop a certain parcel, you had to have the commensurate amount of open space in conservation areas to be restricted from development. And the third effort was a few years ago where it was a AG 160 where the county wanted to establish a base density of 1 unit per 160 acres with an opportunity to transfer development rights to those areas in the growth policy that were identified for growth. All of those efforts never made it to public hearing. From my experience, my observation, those efforts did not have the political will from the county commission to move forward in all 3 cases. Each one had its own specific reasons as to why, but I don't think the political wherewithal, the political support was there to adopt countywide zoning, as we got closer and the regulations got more refined and specific. It was somewhat unfortunate because a lot of work went into that. No hearing was actually scheduled, and it led to 3 planning directors resigning. But not a good example for countywide zoning in Gallatin County. But I had to give credit to all those who involved, including our planning board, which advocated countywide zoning. Give them a lot of credit for the time and effort and resources that went into that, and they saw the benefit of it.
Thank you, Randy. Thanks a lot. Let's hope that we can be more successful in Park County. Robert and Peter Brown and everybody is saying zoning bill is SB 294,
yes.
not 264.
Let me just say that first, I'm not a member of the Montana Bar, Justin is, but I can read statutes and bills. I looked at 8 bills that were listed as relating to land use. None of them make things easier. None of them improve the situation, but as a summary point, I'll say none of them prevent Part 1 or Part 2 zoning from going forward in Park County. Senate Bill 294 had a couple provisions. It indicates that it relates to Part 2, that is County Commission initiated zoning. And it has what it does is it repeals a section of the statute that the Montana Supreme Court found unconstitutional, which required they had a property owner, minority property owners were allowed to invalidate the zoning district. So it repeals that unconstitutional section, but it substitutes a new provision in which 20% or more of the property owners in a zoning district on a petition, if they file that petition, can trigger a vote on whether to retain or repeal the zoning district. So that's, so a minority can force a vote, but a minority can't determine the vote. It has another subsection that relates to minimum lot sizes, but that provision I think is minor and not completely unreasonable. Two other bills prohibit the use of, I think, either Part 1 or Part 2 zoning from controlling mining of any mineral resource. So that certainly would apply to gravel, but also gold and anything else, platinum and palladium. Again, there are other bills. I don't think any of them are fatal. None of them improve the situation, but all of them, I think, have requirements that can be satisfied and still achieve the primary objective of Friends of Park County.
Okay, Robert, thank you. Peter, I hope that answers your question. It's a good question. Other questions? Raise your hand or signal. I'm seeing neither. So, okay. Well, thank you again, Jessen, Randy, and Robert.
Oh,
Very
I'm
informative.
sorry. Frank,
Okay.
this is Wendy again. Sorry, I was
Wendy,
slow.
go ahead.
I was slow to slow to that.
Okay,
To
please.
just follow up on Peter's question and Robert's answer, given the legislative environment, should we be worried about this when it comes to our efforts for land use planning and advocacy for zoning?
Well,
Robert?
Wendy, if I understand your question, saying, would advocating for this stir up and lead to a legislative response? Is that what you're indicating?
Yeah, that could be one of the possibilities.
Well, I think the answer to that, since I'm familiar with that situation, is they won't even have to pass the legislation then if people are so intimidated by the risk of them passing legislation that you do nothing. And I think for Friends of Park County, doing nothing is not really an option. So yes, there's a risk that you stimulate some bill to prevent what's underway, but the legislature just adjourned. There's an opportunity. The bills, at least the ones I read, were not great, but they didn't kill the opportunity to take action and protect quality of life. And it's really self-defeating to say, if we do anything, we may trigger legislative response, so let's not do anything. Again, then the legislature doesn't even have to pass a bill to stop you from doing something. You stop yourself.
Right, but would you see the conflict mitigation zoning district that's proposed, if improved upon, a step in the right direction?
Well, I think this is a question that I would like to pass to the board. I will say this generally is the critique that was presented indicates that I'm not sure that it will actually achieve its own intended results. It may actually generate lots of opposition and conflict. It doesn't guarantee there won't be litigation. So I think that the concluding statement was it's the wrong tool to do what needs to be done. And I hope I'm presenting the board's perspective correctly. Maybe the chair could share the board's perspective on this.
Robert, thank you, Wendy. Good question. Yeah, we have, we were not fans of conflict mitigation. I think everybody knows that. But the planning board made the decision to move forward, to evaluate it, explore it the way it was. We respect that decision. What we've said is a couple of things. As Robert said, number one, we think it's the wrong tool, that there are others that are better, and Robert and everybody talked about those today. But the second thing is that we really would encourage the planning board to consider rural residential sprawl and how to take care of it in parallel with considering conflict mitigation, the ordinance as presented, not in sequence, because we don't believe that there's a time that we can afford to go through the whole process of conflict mitigation, decision making, and then say, okay, now that's taken care of. Whew, good job. Well, okay, now what about residential sprawl? We just don't believe that that we've got a couple of years to lose by not considering stopping sprawl. And we saw the consequences of that in Robert's presentation. I mean, all you have to do is look at the images and also know that there's not a lot to prevent that. So that would be my comment. Ken, as a board member, do you have anything to add to that? And then Jean also, anything to add?
Thank you, Frank.
Yes, I would add
You're welcome.
conflict mitigation has no planning provisions in it at all. One of the main functions of the growth plan that's been enacted, one of the main sections in section 16, it says the county was to prepare a future growth map to define how growth would occur in Park County. They haven't done that. Conflict mitigation doesn't have any of the features that are available in traditional zoning of directing what type of development can go in what zoning district. Under conflict mitigation, you could build any type of structure, residential, commercial, industrial, anywhere in the county. Now, those would require conditional use permits, but it doesn't limit where they would go, and it doesn't limit anything other than to provide for mitigation. So you could have an asphalt plant, which immigrant neighbors opposed. You could have a monofill, which which Protecting Paradise proposed. You could have all of these structures anywhere in the county, next to my house, next to your house, next to the Yellowstone River, as long as mitigation standards were met. The mitigation standards are amorphous. How much noise? How much dust? If you mitigate it, as Robert said, 20%, that's a mitigation. So do we grant that permit? That is not what I think the people of Park County want. They want a planned growth in an orderly fashion so they know what's going to occur where. That can only be done by traditional zoning.
Thanks. Jean, would you like to offer something?
Thanks for the opportunity, Frank. No, I have nothing to add. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Another question from Peter, and this is for you, Randy. Can you tell us about transfer of development rights, TDR, as a tool to protect areas of high community and ecological value?
Well, absolutely. The basic premise of a TDR program where you identify areas that environmentally sensitive areas, as you mentioned, where those would be the sending areas where you don't want development. And then you identify receiving areas where development is appropriate in terms of services, roads, adequate soils, away from sensitive areas, more of those places that can accommodate growth. And so basically what the regulation does, or the technique does, is allow a mechanism, each property is assigned a development right. There's a mechanism to move that development right to where growth is more appropriate. And in some cases, like in the Middle Cottonwood zoning district in Gallen County, if you take a development right, an assigned development right, out of the mule deer winter range and move it outside, that one right can become two. So they create an incentive to transfer these rights. So that's the basic premise. Give everybody the same opportunity, give everybody an equal entitlement. But those places that you don't want development, that are too sensitive for multiple reasons, there's a technique to separate that right, transfer it to an area where you want that development.
Great. Okay, thank you. Well, listen, I think we've just slid past our hour, so let me just kind of conclude. If you're watching this webinar, then you share our concerns and probably want to know what you can do to help. First, if you agree with us that we need traditional zoning, then please share your opinion with the planning board, the county commissioners, and your friends. You'll have that opportunity to do that tomorrow, as it happens, during a special joint meeting of the county commission and the county planning board. That meeting starts at 2:30. The topics for discussion at the meeting include conflict mitigation regulations, growth policy goals, and general community concerns. And there will be an opportunity for public comment at the end of the meeting. This is an ideal time to show up. We know that the commissioners are truly interested in public comment, public participation. So if you can do that, 2:30, and you can find the agenda and the link to the Zoom meeting through the county's website under upcoming events. Second thing you can do is learn more about these issues. You can learn about our principles and find our testimony to the County Planning Board and other resources about rural development and regulation on our website. Again, friendsofparkcounty.org. You find our prior webinar on rural sprawl and the educational programs on rural development presented by Future West, also our partners in this effort. And these programs can be found on the websites for our two organizations. I highly recommend, if you have the time, to go back to see that first presentation Robert made. It's kind of hair-raising, but it's really informative. The third thing you can do is support our work as an endorser or a supporter and contributor on our website, friendsofparkcounty.org. This summer, we're going to be continuing our discussion of zoning and other supplementary measures needed to prevent rural sprawl. In addition to our work on Park County sprawl issues, we have been participating in the deliberations by the Livingston Planning Board on the draft update to the city's growth policy. The Planning Board made remarkable improvements to the draft. It really was a fantastic effort and lots of public participation and lots of interest. It was approved for final adoption by the City Commission last night. The challenge now is going to be the implementation, including some clarifications of what kind of commercial development is allowed outside the city. So we thank you very, very much for joining us today and for your willingness to contribute your time and passion to keeping Park County a place we love and are proud to call home. We wish you a good evening. Thanks again. And over to you, Ken, for a final wrap up.
Frank, you took all my statements. I would like to thank Robert, Jetson, and Randy for providing this most informative educational meeting. We thank our participants for joining in. We hope you found it interesting and informative. Please send us your comments on this meeting and your thoughts for further educational programs to info@friendsofparkcounty.org. Stay safe and have a great evening. Thank you. Bye now.